do that. And yeah, it sometimes takes a little bit of time to warm up anyway. So I'm just going to say, yeah, I'm here and my name is Fiona Malpass. So I'm currently working at Voice Collective, which is a young person's project where we support young people who hear voices, see visions, have other experiences, and we also support their families and any professionals who work with young people who are having those experiences. So you can see our website there if you want to kind of check it out at some point. We've got loads of resources on there that you can access. And you can also find our contact details. So if ever at any point you want to get in touch with us, you can do that. So like I said, I'm Fiona. I'm working at an interim capacity at Mind in Camden at the moment. I have my own experiences of various forms of mental distress, ranging from kind of hearing, seeing things, struggling with kind of other unusual experiences that I actually really struggle to find the words for. And that's sort of one focus that I like to focus on when I'm kind of writing and thinking about working with young people, is that how we don't always have words for things, and how tricky it can be when people are asking what's wrong and you don't have the words to do that. So that's something that I personally have experienced quite a lot of. And yeah, I've done some work at Voice Collective before, so I'll tell you a bit more about it. We're a UK-wide London-based project. Like I said, we support children and young people who hear voices, see visions, have other sensory experiences or beliefs. But we also offer support for parents and families, training for youth workers, social workers, mental health professionals. So again, if any of you are interested in our trainings, you are more than welcome to in terms of what we offer, we do peer support groups for young voice hearers, where they can meet, other young people who are having similar experiences to themselves. We also have creative workshops for young people. So what we do is we get an artist or someone in to do a workshop with the young people that's all about kind of them to share some aspects of themselves and their experiences. We offer one-to-one support, and we have an online forum that has spaces for young people. It has a separate space for parents, and it has another space again for professionals who work with young people. And it's a space where you can kind of get support and share resources with other people. And I've already mentioned our website, and we also offer training and mentoring for parents, youth workers, and anyone who works with young people. So that would include most of yourselves. So if you were working with a young person who's kind of having difficult experiences and you're unsure how to support them, you can just drop us an email or give us a call and we'll be able to kind of have a conversation with you about that. So yeah. Now I'm going to get more into kind of the bulk of what this kind of talk is going to be about, which is all about thinking about how we can support young people who hear voices or have other kinds of experiences like that. And I guess one thing that when we as adults and professionals are working with young people is that we often end up kind of sharing in some way what the young people have shared with us and what they've told us. We talk about their experiences with other people in a mental health team, or with other people we work with, and sometimes I think we need to be more wary about kind of how we retell their story and the words that we choose compared to the words that the young person might have used, and how, if we do that even on an unconscious level, how we are reframing their narrative in some way. So, it's important to kind of think about an example that if you're a young person who's told that voices they hear are hallucinations and that's because they have a mental illness called psychosis, then how might that feel for like a young person who maybe doesn't see their voices in that way, think of them in that way? And if any other belief is kind of called a delusion, and again, that's tied into being mentally ill, then how might that be experienced? Even by us as adults, I think that would be difficult to hear, but for a young person as well, that could be, it could have an impact in lots of areas of their lives, like about their identity. And obviously for children and young people, they're in a process of developing their identity. So how this feeds into the development of their identity and their relationships, and also how they think about their voices. Because one thing that we found at Voice Collective and that has been demonstrated in some research is that when young people have a good relationship with their voices and are able to think about them in different ways and respond in different ways, that can be more useful in terms of reducing their distress around the experiences. So having a focus on thinking about how we can create some sort of relationship between a young person and their voices is part of what we do at Voice Collective. So in terms of the language we use at Voice Collective, we do try to avoid the kind of more clinical language, although if a young person feels that that language fits them and it works for them, then we do use it, but we don't kind of just apply one language to use as neutral language as possible. People are hearing things, we just go with it as hearing things. People see things or see people, we say that they see things or they see people. And rather than delusions, we talk about beliefs. So that there's kind of, it's just a bit more neutral when we're kind of having conversations with young people about it. Rather than necessarily jumping to kind of the illness model, we think about distress, overwhelm, fear, sadness, grief instead. And that just kind of opens up different perspectives of kind of how we can think about what people are going through. So the term hearing voices kind of covers a broad range of experiences. So it can be hearing voices and sounds, doesn't necessarily have to be voices. It can be bells ringing, or I know that for me at times, I kind of, when I'm in a situation where things feel like they're going wrong, I can hear like literal alarm bells. Like I know that's a phrase that, that rings alarm bells, but for me, I actually tend to hear some sort of alarm bell when things are going wrong for me. Visions and images, so people can see things and have images flash in front of them. People can smell things that other people don't, can have touch and tactile sensations. I know that a really common one, and one that I've had before, is kind of feeling like insects are crawling on your skin or inside your skin. And also taste, so people can kind of taste things that maybe aren't there as well. So it kind of covers all the senses. So here's kind of some stats for people who are kind of more into that kind of thing. So it's just looking at kind of how common those kinds of experiences actually can be, especially amongst young people. And, about how there's kind of a bit of a spectrum of experiences, like thinking about how do imaginary friends come into this, and how do we need to kind of distinguish between kind of voices and imaginary friends and all this kind of stuff. There's some really interesting thinking going on around that kind of work. But it's just kind of looking at different rates of having what might be called psychotic symptoms or kind of other symptoms in young people. I'm not going to read it all out to you because it's all there. And also the slides and everything will be available afterwards if you kind of want to follow up on this stuff. The main takeaway from this is that it's kind of more common than a lot of people think. And part of my kind of synopsis for this talk was about kind of thinking about working creatively with young people. And when I kind of say working creatively with young people, a lot of the time people think it means kind of getting the arts and crafts box out and kind of doing some drawing. which can be part of it. But for me, it's kind of more about how we work with a young person and flexibility and adaptability and being able to come up with, coping strategies and answers and ways forward that are tailored to the young person. So, for example, with one young person who was really into playing video games, one thing we did is we played a game called The Sims, where you get to make kind of lots of different people and characters and kind of call them what you want and dress them and create them however you want. And this young person made a different person for each of their voices. And so they kind of gave a visual representation of them. And then in playing the game, got a sense for kind of what kind of person that voice might be and kind of what they might do. And it just created a kind of dialogue with them. So that's one way that you can kind of work creatively with young people without kind of, necessarily getting the crayons out. So I also want to think about some questions that we can be asking young people rather than thinking about kind of, why are they hearing voices or why are they ill, for example. Might be worth thinking more about why do some young people hear voices that they struggle to cope with, because a lot of people hear voices that they find really positive and really comforting and reassuring. And a lot of those people don't end up in mental health services because they just have that different relationship with their voices. And, why do some young people hear the more distressing and overwhelming voices? Just thinking through kind of why that might be. They might be more useful questions to kind of be asking ourselves when we meet young people that are struggling with voices. And kind of back to other parts of this talk, it's about how you can make a difference, because actually the way we work at Voice Collective, it's not rocket science. It's nothing massively specialist where you have to do lots of training. And actually at Voice Collective, kind of the main thing we value really is, kind of having experience of distress and kind of being able to use that to relate to others. But at the same time, we also hold in mind that our experience of distress will in no means give us any insight into another person's distress, because we can't, know to assume their experience based on our own. But just being able to have some empathy for that can be really useful. And so, for us as supportive adults, what can we do to let young people know it's okay to talk about voices and visions? So it kind of relies on us being open to hearing about it. So, if you kind of maybe give some sort of vibes that you really don't believe in voices, or that you kind of think that it's not okay to talk about them or anything like that, then it's going to be very difficult for young people to feel like they can kind of tell you about what's going on for them. So, we have information on flyers at Voice Collective that you could have available. And it's something that you can kind of raise in everyday conversations, or just kind of having space to kind of bring it to a conversation with the young person you might suspect is having those kinds of issues. Like, for example, there are plenty of famous people out there who have had some sort of experience of hearing voices. And so kind of just bringing that into some sort of conversation can sometimes be a way of bringing this stuff to the fore in a way that's not too obvious and confronting. But also it is okay to kind of, ask a young person directly, because then we're kind of inviting them specifically to kind of share what's going on for them with us. And there's someone called Professor Gail Hornstein who researched recovery narratives, and from that she drew some key themes that emerged as being most useful to people in their recovery process. And these were kind of being listened to, being believed, having an empathic witness to someone's suffering, and being seen as capable of becoming fully well. So those are all things that I think we can all manage to do. I don't think we need any kind of specific training or qualification to do this kind of stuff. Just listening to people, believing them, being an empathic witness to their suffering and whatever else they want to share with us. And just, yeah, holding hope for them and believing that they can get through. Because once, especially with young people, once the people around them start to become hopeless, then that just creates a kind of almost like a whirlpool of hopelessness that a young person can really struggle to get out of. So you can kind of be someone who kind of provides a bit of a stopper for that. And so yeah, just thinking a little bit about opening up conversations and thinking about kind of the things I've just spoken about kind of, maybe trying to stay calm, because it can be a bit, for some people, it can be a bit of a shock or a bit of a surprise for a young person, hearing voices and kind of panic about how to react for the best and things like that. So part of that is staying calm, because a lot of the time how the people in a young person's life react to them telling them about their voices can influence how they feel about the voices themselves. So if we react in a scared and panicked way, then chances are that the young person is going to pick up on that, and then they will then integrate that into their experience, and it can influence them feeling scared and panicked about their experiences and their voices. So it's quite important for us to kind of be able to hold it, and kind of, if we are kind of, finding it anxiety provoking, just really taking some time to think that through. And also respectfully exploring experiences from the child's perspective. So thinking about the young person and really prioritizing them and their story and their narrative, rather than kind of, trying to draw them in any particular direction, just giving them an open space to kind of talk about it however they feel is helpful. And like I said, kind of when we have anxieties about stuff that people bring to us, we can often close down conversations, not always on purpose, but when people kind of bring something to our attention that worries us, and then we can then kind of feel some sort of reluctance to talk about it. So this happens with lots of things, not just kind of around voice hearing, but around kind of suicidality, self-harm. There can be lots of ways that our anxiety about having kind of quite frank conversations about that can mean that we just kind of try and, either on a conscious or unconscious level, not have that conversation. So some examples can be kind of trying to, see whether they've spoken to anyone else about it and encourage them to talk to someone else and not you about it. Or trying to change the subject, or there are all these different things that we can do when we're kind of anxious about talking about something with someone, where we kind of try to avoid it. So I think, it's important for us all to kind of take time to think through where our anxieties lie, where they kind of stem from, and kind of how we can settle those, so that when we are with young people who are reaching out to us and opening up to us, that we can actually engage with them and kind of, be open to that conversation. So I'm going, like I mentioned earlier, thinking about how we can approach things in a creative way with young people. It can be anything from, like I said, painting, photography, drama, drawing, stories, poetry, but it's also about things like being flexible in your approach and individualizing your work, not being afraid to kind of work a bit differently, and being adaptable with. And another thing with kind of voice hearing is that role plays can be really useful as well. Whether it's kind of role playing conversations with voices, or role playing conversations with how they might want to tell their parents about kind of their voices if they're a bit worried about that. So that can be actually a really useful tool as well. So I just wanted to give a bit of context to kind of thinking about why do young people hear voices, because there are so many different frameworks out there as to understanding these kinds of experiences. And so I just wanted to kind of put up a few examples of like the different ways that people can think about voice hearing, and just different lenses, I guess, of kind of looking at these experiences. And it could be like a combination of these as well. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And, some are seen as perhaps more valid than others, but that's not necessarily the case. I know that the kind of medical model is kind of the strongest one, that's the most dominant framework in our society. But actually being able to kind of introduce these other frameworks to young people, that their experiences could be a whole range of things, and to find one that kind of makes sense to them rather than kind of imposing one narrative, can be really useful, because it's when a young person kind of has the power to make sense of their experiences in a way they want to and that makes sense to them, that you can really support them with it. Whereas if you're kind of, if a certain narrative is kind of imposed on them, then that doesn't fit with their understanding, then that can create lots of problems. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about the benefits of working creatively with young people, because it can really motivate young people to have like a more creative approach to being supported, way of building confidence in expressing their views, ideas, and feelings. It builds rapport. So, being able to work in like a different way with someone rather than necessarily just sitting down with them and talking can be a really nice way to build up a different kind of relationship with them, and have kind of different kinds of conversations. It encourages greater levels of engagement, other ways of working, different methods of self-expression, and an exploration of coping strategies and ways of thinking. And so just about kind of also being able to kind of trial and error different coping strategies. So some may work for a young person, some may not. Some may work at a certain point or with a certain situation for a young person, but at other times or other situations not work. So it's important to kind of be, as flexible and adaptable as we can be with this stuff. So I found it really important to also think about potential drawbacks of kind of creatively working with young people. But I guess one thing that I've encountered is that young people, particularly who have like more experience of the mental health system and stuff, become very used to a particular way of adults working with them and talking to them. And so when we try and open up new approaches, it can be quite difficult for them to feel okay with, because they're not used to it. Also, young people may feel too shy or self-conscious to engage in some activities. I know that whenever people tried to get me to kind of draw a painting of how I'm feeling, I just kind of didn't feel like I'd be able to kind of do that. And I just felt I just didn't feel able to engage with that. Peer pressure, negative perceptions of the activities as well. So if you're kind of doing something like, I don't know, I know that for some people kind of playing with sand sounds really childish, and kind of, some young people don't really want to do that, but also that's like a really useful kind of sort of play therapy tool as well. So if there's kind of negative perceptions around a certain technique you're trying to use, then that can be a kind of barrier to them engaging. Activities need to be targeted at the age group and what they need and kind of what they're wanting. But also young people may feel too unmotivated to participate. So they might be too overwhelmed or too distressed or feeling too low or any of those kinds of things. But we can still use creativity in our work by kind of doing all the things I've been talking about. It does kind of leave a space where talking isn't particularly necessary. So I've just got this page up about talking because like I said before, sometimes talking can be really difficult and not having words can be really difficult. But also sometimes people have voices telling them that they shouldn't talk about them and that you shouldn't say anything. Having threatening voices can be quite difficult. Working together in a creative way with the individual can help create a safe space and a form of expression that they're comfortable with. And I've kind of covered this already, that it's important to kind of find coping strategies that empower a young person, that help them identify what they think is good to support them, and how, their relationship with their voices can mirror other aspects of their life. So working with their voices, it might then translate to other. I just want to also give a quick nod to kind of coping strategies as maladaptive, and how actually they help a young person survive. So no matter what other people think about them, they are using it for a reason, and they find it and they continue using it for a reason. So it's really important to explore that with them, and rather than judging the coping strategy they're using, to just kind of sit with it and kind of explore it. And then, you can maybe start thinking about other coping strategies. One thing I do want to say with the coping strategies is that don't throw loads of different coping strategies at a young person in the hopes that some of them will stick. Just take a bit of time to get to know the young person, think about what might be useful for them, use that as your grounding for coming up with strategies, giving them a list printed off from the internet or something like that. It would be more helpful, I think, if you just take some time to get to know them and collaborate as well, so working together on that. So there are kind of lots of different strategies around kind of keeping calm, encouraging safety, like grounding. There's things like blocking voices out by watching TV or listening to music. There's expressive strategies where you can, paint it or use poetry. And there's empowering strategies where you can kind of help a young person think about how they might say no to voices that are telling them. I'm aware that I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to go through the last few slides really quickly. Yeah, engaging with and getting to know voices can be really insightful, but you need to remember it's a young person's journey, so it's their perspective that counts. So I'll stop there because, that's pretty much most of what I've had to say. And I know that we have some questions. So let's have a look. Okay, so how young people can request involvement with Voice Collective. Yes, that they can absolutely approach them ourselves. So we have an email support service, which is info@voicecollective.co.uk. And any young people up to the age of 18 can use that service. But we also have an online forum and a online peer support group for 16 to 25-year-olds. And so if a child is obsessionally talking about very negative experiences of their voices, repeating the same story, should you always listen and give them time, or also try to move on and distract them and say there is time to talk, but it is not now? Okay, this isn't the easiest balance to find. And part of this comes from being able to know the young person that you're working with, the child you're working with, and have a sense of what they might find helpful. So I guess also another thing is actually being quite frank with young people. They tend to really appreciate that. So you could say that, you talk about this aspect of your voices a lot. And I guess I'm wondering how helpful it is that we're kind of stuck listening to having this same conversation over and over again. And would you like to maybe think about things we can do or talk about that might kind of change things a bit for you? Because I think, yes, you should always listen, but that's not to say that you can't try and open up space for other conversations and other things to happen. But also, if they are kind of repeating the same story and it's kind of very negative, then maybe you can spend some time kind of just thinking about why that might be, and taking some time to explore that with them. I think, and maybe, with their voices, they, setting boundaries, the kind of whole, there is time to talk, but it's not now. Maybe they could actually learn to do that with their voices themselves. So I know some people with their voices, they'll be like, I need to work today, so I'll give you space at like 4:00 when I'm finishing work. Then you can talk. And voices sometimes actually really respond to that. So it might be about just kind of finding different ways of kind of navigating the space with the voices. Have you got any ideas as to why this seems more prevalent in teenagers? To be honest, nothing specific. I know that there's kind of lots of research into kind of, marijuana use and voice hearing. I also know that kind of, you know, there's a lot of young people out there who have been through a kind of a lot of stress and trauma in their lives. And I think when, yeah, the kind of time of being a teenager is very stressful. And I know that for me, that's when I had my breakdown. So I kind of feel like that's a time when lots of stresses are all kind of coming together. And I think, yeah, being a teenager is really hard, and that can manifest itself in lots of different ways. And, you know, voices aren't necessarily a negative thing. It might just be that, you know, voices come through as a way of young people navigating their life and kind of coping with being a teenager and what they're going through. But yeah, it's just something that, yeah, I don't have all the answers, and I think it would be wrong to presume that there is any answer to that, really, because different people have different perspectives. So yeah, for me, there's kind of no one reason as to why it's more prevalent in teenagers, because I think there are lots of possibilities that are all quite feasible. I think the more important thing to focus on is that there are lots of young people who are affected by this and who are distressed by this. So it's about thinking about how we can, one, create a world that is maybe less distressing for them to kind of be in and live in, but also just creating a society where people are more able to kind of talk about what's going on for themselves and to have more support, really. So yeah, that would be my answer to that. Okay. Is there time to answer more questions? I'm just kind of aware that we're kind of going a bit over time here, so I'm just kind of checking with the hosts whether they're okay for me to carry on answering questions, or whether they'd rather me just wind things down.
Please do continue, Fiona. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So if people are happy for me to keep talking and aren't sick of my voice yet. So what if the young person's coping strategy is drug or alcohol use, which then triggers overwhelming voices again? What advice would you give? I feel like a bit like an agony aunt right now with all these questions coming through. It's quite funny. But yeah, I think for young people, they tend to turn to drug, alcohol when, yeah, they're kind of really struggling with difficult stuff, and it's perhaps the only thing they've found that works for them. Like, I can't speak for all young people, but I know that a lot of them will kind of try lots of different things, and then the thing that they turn to can be something that's kind of less, yeah, maybe kind of seen as kind of less helpful as others. But, you know, not all young people are up for kind of trying yoga and meditation, which tend to be the kind of go-to advice given to people these days, or at least that's been my experience. And yeah, sometimes people do turn to kind of drugs or alcohol when they're just kind of overwhelmed and wanting a break. But I guess it might be exploring with them what it is about drug and alcohol use that they find helpful, and what else, and kind of unpicking what parts of it are helpful, and thinking about how they might be able to find those helpful aspects of it in other things, especially if it's in this cycle of that triggering overwhelming voices. So it's kind of maybe having a conversation about kind of, I'm aware that kind of using drug and alcohol you find, you know, helpful in some way, because otherwise you wouldn't keep going back to it. But at the same time, I'm also aware that that can be triggering for more overwhelming voices for you. So it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. And I want to work together with you to think about how we can maybe break that cycle and help make things a bit easier for you. And so kind of going back to what I've said in the rest of this presentation about kind of collaborating with them, thinking on a really personal level about kind of what's going on in their lives and what they find useful, and what you can come up with together in a collaborative way that makes sense to them. Because if you're kind of giving them things that don't make sense to them, then it's not going to work. So that's where it comes back to just working with them and being adaptive and flexible and creative with how you think about things. I hope that answers your question. Are there any ways to help identify when children's voices are loud self-talk as opposed to auditory hallucinations? So I didn't really cover that, and I guess that's because I personally question whether it matters that much. So I know that in the mental health field, there's also, a lot of kind of, when someone says they're hearing voices, there's a lot of emphasis about whether kind of the voices are heard internally or externally, or whether they're kind of thoughts or self-talk or these kinds of things. And for me, I guess I wonder how helpful it is to kind of make those distinctions, and whether maybe it's more about trying to focus on the distress of the young person and finding ways to reduce that distress. And I don't think knowing whether it's like figuring out whether it's voices or loud self-talk would be useful in that, I guess. And also it could be both, it could be other things, it could be, there's a lot of unknowns. And I think as human beings, we're very drawn to kind of wanting answers, not liking sitting with uncertainty. But for me, that's actually makes it all the more important to do that, to be able to sit with that kind of not knowing and still just kind of try and push forward in other ways to try and make sense of things and try and find things that help. So yeah, you can ask the young person, I guess, if you wanted to, and kind of, but then it would come down to kind of believing their answer, and maybe asking them how they feel about it and what their experience of it is, and that kind of thing, just being curious about their experiences. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Is there any specific advice around supporting a child who has experienced trauma and hearing voices? So there's quite a lot of work in the hearing voices movement around kind of trauma and hearing voices. Not all of it is geared towards young people, but there are a few books out there there's one by Sandra Escher, which is about kind of voice hearing in young people. There's also someone called Judith Herman, who has written a really fantastic book on trauma, that covers it in a lot of depth and from different perspectives and different types of trauma, because I think sometimes trauma narratives can be reduced to kind of thinking about certain types of trauma, but actually there are lots of different ways people can be traumatized. So I like that Judith Herman is kind of open to thinking about lots of different ways people can be traumatized and the impacts that can have on them. So yeah, big fan of Judith Herman's work on trauma. When a child makes an initial disclosure to you of hearing voices, are there any questions you would definitely ask to help with that initial assessment? Equally, what would you definitely not say or ask? Good question. I think I would encourage questions that show that you are curious about their experiences, that makes it feel like you are creating a space where it's okay to talk about hearing voices. So I know that from my own experience, I was often asked, like, how many are there? What genders are they? And all this kind of stuff. And it was quite overwhelming to give answers to those, because sometimes it's not as clear cut as that. So I would kind of avoid directly asking those questions, because if those things are a factor, then I'd like to think a young person would share those things with you of their own volition, rather than you kind of asking the questions about those things. For me, it's more about kind of, if they tell me that they're hearing voices, I'm kind of like, what's that like for you? How do you experience that? How do you make sense of those voices? Like, what are they to you? What kind of voices do you have? And, if they're kind of, and asking about kind of, if they're kind of talking about a lot of negative voices, then maybe asking whether they have any positive voices, ones that are maybe more comforting, because sometimes young people can get a bit wrapped up in kind of all the difficult negative ones, and it can be easy to forget about the more positive ones that they might have. But obviously sometimes people don't have don't have positive voices and they're kind of stuck with a lot of negative ones. And so, yeah, just kind of, asking questions that are very open and where the young person can kind of have, a range of ways to respond in ways that they feel comfortable with. And just, that's kind of my thing about that. I mean, I guess for me, it's less about kind of assessment and more about just kind of exploration with them. But I know that kind of within certain settings, a certain kind of assessment is expected to be done. And that's where I suppose I kind of hope people will kind of find a bit of wiggle room to kind of go about things in a less kind of question after question way, tick box answer way, and just be able to just sit there with the young person and acknowledge what they're saying, bear witness to what they're saying in an empathic way, you know, back to Gail Hornstein, listen to them, believe them, hear them, and just be open to hearing whatever they want to say about it and being willing to go with that and work with that. So that, I'm sorry if that doesn't completely answer your question, but that's kind of my response to it. So I hope it's at least useful in some way. So that's pretty much the end of the questions. So I don't know whether anyone else has any other questions. I guess if not, then it will be time to close down. So if you do have any other questions, just put them in the question and answer box, and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, so I've had a question about how to address in a school setting in, I think that says in a lesson. I guess for me that comes, that's a difficult question because there's so much context to that I wouldn't have, because, if it comes up in a lesson in a school setting, do you mean like bringing it up as a topic to talk about, or are you talking about a young person who in a lesson starts talking about their experiences, or could you just elaborate on that question for me? Okay, so young person starts talking themselves, so not to do with the lesson. Okay. I mean, I guess it depends on what the young person is doing, and how that's kind of being responded to in the lessons. So, I guess it would be about having a conversation with the young person about kind of what's going on for them, and why they're kind of what's kind of happening in their environment, or what's going on for them at that time for them to kind of be behaving in that way, especially if it's kind of different to how they usually behave. So it might be kind of a new thing, and it might be about having a conversation about kind of what's going on for them. And I just think it's really important to just stay non-judgmental and to just create as kind of an open environment for young people as possible, where, because by us modeling our openness to kind of people behaving in different ways, people talking about things that other people might find strange, the more we model being okay with that, the more the young people will take that on as well. Because I'm imagining if a young person starts kind of talking about that stuff in a lesson, how that might be for the other young people. And, it's not an easy thing to kind of, I would say come on some of our trainings, because then we'd be able to kind of help people to respond to that kind of thing. Because I don't think I can cover that kind of thing in this time frame. I think that takes a lot more time to unpick. So I'm going to do a shameless plug for our training. and recommend that just, yeah, you do our training. And anyone else who feels like that would be useful to come onto our training. Oh, lots more questions. Okay, have you ever come across a link between selective mutism and hearing voices? I haven't come across a specific link, and I haven't come across specific research that looks into that. However, I know that that can definitely be a thing. I mean, I know that it is for me, that at times, yeah, I go nonverbal and kind of mute, and I don't always know why that is either. Sometimes it's when I'm very overwhelmed, and it can kind of be, yeah, trying so much to kind of keep everything inside that I'm so scared of letting anything out that I just kind of go mute. Or sometimes it's that I'm so distracted by everything going on in my head that I kind of can't speak. Or sometimes, yeah, I just become in this kind of frozen state where I can't talk. I'm glad that hasn't happened in this webinar, because that would have been awkward. But yeah, I think selective mutism can be a coping strategy in itself. And yeah, it's again something that you can explore with a young person when they're feeling able to talk, or if they're not feeling able to talk, then again comes in the kind of finding creative ways for young people to express themselves, and working with them to find a way to communicate that does feel okay. So I know that with some young people, we'll kind of have like, if they have times where they struggle to speak, we'll maybe have cards with different things written on them with different responses they might give. So then they can hold up a card that kind of gives the response they'd like to give. With other young people who kind of struggle to say when they're not okay with how a conversation is going or how safe it feels to talk about something, we'll have like a green, amber, and red flag or piece of paper, so that when kind of something is like a no-go area that they don't want to go into, they can hold up the red piece of paper. And so all these different things and ways of communicating and just thinking outside the box a little bit and kind of working with the young person to think about how to navigate these things can be really useful. What would be reassuring phraseology in the moment so don't feel shame? I guess that comes back to what I was saying about kind of how we try to use non-judgmental language at Voice Collective, but we also go with whatever language that the young person comes to us with. So we have some young people who come to me who say that they hear spirits, or that they kind of have their grandfather talking to them, or some people prefer their voices to be referred to as people rather than voices. And some people say that they kind of see things, but some people say that they kind of have hallucinations and all this kind of stuff. So for me, it's all about kind of using the phraseology that the young person uses, because that's the most reassuring thing you can do, that what they're saying to you is okay. And by reflecting the same language back at them, it just kind of helps them know that you're open to hearing about their experiences and that you're not looking to kind of judge or change that, I guess. So there's another question. Any comments about spiritual experience related particularly to Black heritage? So I think for me, as a white person, I've been trying to do reading and learning around kind of different experiences of voice hearing across kind of different cultures and so on. And so there are kind of lots of different approaches to voice hearing that are very different from the kind of white Western approach. And statistically, Black people are more likely to be sectioned and hospitalized than white people. They're more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia and given antipsychotics. And I think, yeah, that's a massive problem with the structural kind of racism in mental health, but also like in wider society. And yeah, when there's kind of a mismatch of kind of cultural understandings, that can be like really disastrous, and cause a lot of pain and distress, because yeah, I've had people come to me who feel like they're possessed, or that there's a jinn, or that, you know, that the kind of experiences they're having are related to their ancestors, and they've kind of been put in touch with kind of mental health services who have told them that they have a mental illness and that they need to take antipsychotic medication for it, and that has been massively harmful for them. And actually having someone who, you know, at times I kind of didn't know much about what they were telling me, but being curious about it and kind of wanting to hear more about, yeah, their thoughts and their experiences and their understandings, and kind of, yeah, looking into that together has been really useful. So yeah, I kind of feel like, yeah, with kind of spiritual experiences, that can be a difficult perspective for mental health services to kind of get on board with. But there are networks out there that do focus on kind of what might be seen as kind of mental health issues actually being spiritual emergencies. So there used to be, I'm sure there's something that still exists along the spiritual emergence network lines, where that was full of people who viewed their experiences as part of a spiritual emergence, and were working to kind of campaign on that, and yeah, share experiences and resources, and to create more awareness around kind of those understandings of these kinds of experiences as well, because yeah, it wasn't always kind of the yeah, it would often get misunderstood, and quite often it gets pathologized. So to have kind of people out there doing work to kind of, yeah, normalize it and kind of make it a framework in itself is really good, I think. So I hope that kind of answers your question. Yeah. Okay. So I think this is the last question, which kind of ties into part of my answer to the last question. What is the makeup of the young people, I guess, along differences, i.e. gender, class, ethnicity? Is there an overrepresentation of a particular demographic? So thinking about mental distress more generally, it does seem to be more linked to things like poverty, trauma, stigma and discrimination and prejudice. So, for example, racism, sexism, homophobia, all those things tie into people having higher levels of distress. So there's definitely a link between those kinds of things, but also, yeah, in terms of the young people that I work with, you know, there is a whole range. So, you know, there are kind of white middle class young people. There are kind of, yeah, but also people from other demographics. So I think in my work, I kind of meet a whole range, but I'm also very aware that Voice Collective could be doing more to reach out to other groups. And I think, yeah, that the kind of more general statistics that demonstrate how kind of being in some sort of yeah, like not having some sort of privilege and kind of being disadvantaged is linked to various types of distress, actually. I know that kind of suicides and stuff are very high in LGBTIAQ groups, and yeah, other forms of struggle really tie into that. So and yeah, voice hearing is often, well, not often, but quite a lot of the time can be part of the stress that people feel, as part of kind of, I guess, perhaps as a response to that kind of discrimination and disadvantage. I mean, some people like to think of it as kind of an outlet, or yeah, just kind of the mind's way of coping with that kind of stuff. Or it could be seen as like a reflection of that stuff, because I know that a lot of people who have been through kind of various traumas and bullying and things often hear voices that kind of reflect that. And some young Black people that I've worked with have kind of had very racist voices that have kind of made things very difficult for them. So voices can also be a reflection of kind of the world around us, and that also fits in with kind of paranoia and beliefs. There is like a paranoia network where they kind of say that, you know, paranoia, there's some research that shows as well that paranoia and beliefs can be related to the world or a society that a person lives in. So a lot of people kind of in the Western world have a lot of beliefs around kind of conspiracies of being spied on and all this kind of stuff. But also, you know, with all the kind of NSA stuff that comes out and all the kind of CCTV that's all around us and the kind of constant monitoring of social media and kind of always being around that kind of thing, maybe it doesn't take much to kind of, you know, have that belief of kind of being surveyed and that kind of transforming into other stuff as well. So yeah, there's also a massive thing around kind of context and kind of where the young person is and kind of their where they kind of sit and kind of what's going on for them. So it's important to take that into account as well. Okay, I think that's all the questions. So thank you so much for those. It was really good to put my thinking cap on to have to respond to them. So thank you for those. Yeah, and as I said before, if you are interested in doing our trainings or whatever, just kind of drop me an email or go on the Voice Collective website to find out more about kind of what we do and how we can support you. Thanks.